And I would like to turn it over to Miriam. And what I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm going to try to put everything in the chat for you to follow, knowing that we'll get started in just a minute. So Miriam, it is great to have you with the Spiritist community tonight. We appreciate all that you're going to offer.
It is so good to be with you. I'm sorry I haven't been with you for the other sessions. They all sound fantastic. So hopefully tonight I will be given two lectures, kind of with some peace in between for conversation. And most of what I will say is on the Google Doc. Can you see my screen okay? Just nod if you can. Thank goodness.
Yes. And Miriam, if you could give me just a second, I wasn't able to copy and paste everything. So let me try again. So sorry, now I can't get back to the, I get back.
Do you need me to do anything?
No, I can't get back to the screen that lets me. Could you stop sharing just for a second?
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Thanks. I'm sorry, I just couldn't get into, let's see. I don't know why it's not letting me copy. Let me do maybe the first. Sorry, everybody, I'm having a hard time getting all of the slides. Let me go up to slide 7 and see if that works.
How many have the Google Doc open? One? Okay. Two.
It's not letting me copy that much text, so I'm trying smaller and smaller amounts to see
I copied the whole thing. Let me see if I can paste it in for you. It won't paste.
Yes, somehow. Oh, let me try one more thing. All right.
I tried to copy it. I could copy it, but I just can't drop it into the message box.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. I'm trying to share it through a different.
How did you copy it?
just on the Google Doc itself, highlighting it and then copy and paste.
The other thing that what I did is I just shrunk the Google document down a little bit and had
Yeah.
half the screen the Google Doc and half the screen the chat Zoom.
So that's probably what I'm going to recommend at this point, because for some reason it's not letting us. So that's the Google Doc if you want to click on that. And if you're okay not necessarily having to follow along with each screen and just listening to the narration, please do that. Again, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm so glad this is being recorded so that my incompetence will be remembered forever.
You can edit this out.
Thank you very much. All right, so sorry for the delay. Again, for those you who are following along with the slides, please use the Google Doc that's in the chat. If you have any questions or if you need to pause at any point, please put that in the chat as well, or unmute yourself and just ask if that's okay, Miriam, or should we wait until the end?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great, thank you.
So tonight I want to talk about bodies, and more people are recognizing the bombardment of images and ideas about how our bodies and our relationship to them are shaped, informed, and deformed by a Western ideal. This ideal has been shaped by our Christian faith as well, which bodies fit in the pulpit, in the pews, in the coffee corner, or the Zoom breakout. Where do we encounter God, and in whose bodies? And what bodies deviate from this norm? How is this deviance named or perceived? So some of you may have heard of Nancy Iceland. She wrote a book called The Disabled God. And just read this quote from her. Much of my life I waited for a mighty revelation of God. I did experience an epiphany, but it bore little resemblance to the God I was expecting, or the God of my dreams. In 1996, Nancy's book was released, and from that, the field of disability theology continues to emerge. Although she is most known for her work with the image of the risen, wounded Jesus, she challenged us in accessibility of church buildings, more of disabled people, how we read scripture, particularly mentions of sin and disability, and in how we view and understand God. one of her most striking contributions, I think, is her image of God in a sick, puff wheelchair. It wasn't the God of her expectations or her dreams. She was not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. I recognize the incarnate Christ in the image of those judged not feasible, unemployable, and with questionable quality of life. Here was God for me. In a similar way, her work on the disabled body of the risen Christ bearing the wounds of the resurrection does not engage in a battle for dominance or create a new normative power. Like other liberation theologians, she was, God is in the present social symbolic order at the margins with people with disabilities and integrates transformation from this decentered position. So she imagines God at the margins and the risen, wounded, disabled body of Jesus as the transformative and transforming image for us. Here is the resurrected Christ making good on the incarnational proclamation that God would be with us, embodied as we are, incorporating the fullness of human contingency and ordinary life into God, and presenting his impaired hands and feet to his ordered friends. The resurrected Jesus is revealed as the disabled God. The disabled God is not only the one from heaven, but the revelation of true personhood, underscoring the reality that full personhood is fully compatible with the experience of disability. So disability activists outside the church continue to disrupt which minds and bodies are considered normal or ideal. And I like to put crip theory or disability theory in conversation with theology. So that's where we'll turn now.
And Miriam, could I pause for just a minute to see if there are any questions or if anybody needs clarification on anything? That I just want to highlight that last piece. Some of you may have heard about crip theology. Again, that's crip theology and disability studies are, if there's more you want to look at on that, Googling those two words would reveal a lot for you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I heard, I think it was with reference to the author and that, and clarify for me if I heard correctly, that she is putting forth a theology of disability that is set apart from, I think I heard, the pitiable suffering servant. And I, that tweaked my nose in the sense that as a person with a disability and as a person who studied theology, I never viewed the suffering servant as pitiable. And instead have viewed the suffering servant as the embodiment of power. A parable of sorts that speaks to the first shall be last and the last shall be first, that challenges the conventions and understandings of power and beauty.
Yeah.
That the suffering servant is a reflection, and of course, you know, this is not something that everybody buys into, and certainly is not a theology that fits all situations. But for me, the suffering servant in many ways embodies the sins of the community of which they are a part. And that is symbolic of not only human bodies, but also of the natural world. And so I have used the parable of the suffering servant to take a different look at urban centers that have no trees, that have broken concrete, where the houses are dilapidated, where there's trash in the street. And to, instead of looking upon that center as a place that's unattractive, that's ugly, that it instead reflects the ugliness, the sin back onto the greater community to ask, why does the city look like this? And why are people in this part of this particular place suffering? And again, reflecting that back to human bodies, you know, to issues of disability, as well as issues that impact able-bodied communities as well. So I just, again, with my history and my work with the suffering servant, to hear it cast off as something that's pitiable and something that we should disregard is actually painful.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't think she was referencing the suffering servant in Isaiah. I think she was referencing that idea that disability is often conflated with suffering and pity. So she was trying to disarm that view of disability.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. That's helpful.
I'm glad to hear you receive comfort and power from the suffering servant, because that's a very powerful text. Thank
Yeah,
you.
very, very much so. And I think that it's often misunderstood and misinterpreted in a way that's really unfortunate, because I agree with you. It's incredibly powerful for a variety of different reasons and in a variety of different contexts. So thank you.
I wonder, Mike, if you could read the quote.
Sure. Happy to. From, is it Leonard Davis?
Yeah.
Okay. When we think of bodies in a society where the concept of the norm is operative, then people with disabilities will be thought of as deviants. This, as we have seen, is in contrast to societies with the concept of an ideal in which all people have a non-ideal status.
Yeah. And this reading by Davis is quite heavy but important. Rather than try to summarize it, I highlight how he framed the disabled body in the history of categorizing normals and those who fall outside the norms or ideal or deviant. Davis clearly asserts that no one can ever live up to the ideal, but as I mentioned, this doesn't stop society and church from classifying who is normal or more ideal. As with theological interpretations and practices, there can be an unspoken or spoken assumption that disabled people would rather be closer to the normal individual. This, of course, is the case cutting across and between other marginalized peoples through race, ethnicity, income, sexuality, body size, etc., etc. At the theme of this conversation arises the practice of eugenics, including sterilization that has been done to eliminate defective, a category that has included the feeble-minded, the deaf, the blind, the physically defective, and so on. We may think this is the historical reality, but the conversation continues in some form today. Think about the conversations around the economy, especially as we begin seeing beyond the pandemic. Conversations around national fitness in the body politic requires bodies to be productive. These Norman ideas seep into our churches and can also be supported by theologies. This is what Nancy and other authors are challenging, disrupting, and reimagining. And I get you to read the next quote.
Sure.
Mike.
But the writers in this reader are not simply trying to include disability under the rubric of normal, but to question the idea of normality. It's less a question of segregating the normal from the abnormal, the old eugenic game, as it is to describe, detail, theorize, and occupy the category of disability. Along these lines, intersectionality, the subject position of holding multiple identities, makes complex the general rubric of disability itself. If anything, this collection of essays serves to render complex the simple fact of impairment, while rendering simple the ideological screen of normality.
So as David points out, crip studies and what I'm doing in crip theology, it doesn't try to expand the category of normal, but to question it and to complicate the understanding of disability as well, especially through intersecting identities. We're gonna move on to a conversation around worship and disability. But before that, let's just pause to see if there are questions or anything.
Yeah, and feel free to unmute or raise your hand if you're in the, in the Zoom audience, or put something in the chat. But I know I'm really, this whole idea that's, I know it's been powerfully rooted in me, about people being pitied, about who's worth more and who's worth less, and that somehow people with disabilities must want a different life. That there's a normalcy that others enjoy, that they would strive for, kind of thing. And that's just such a, I hear that reinforced in so many different ways. And so I appreciate your bringing that up. And then similar to what you were saying, Courtney, of just that reflecting back these powerful realities for everyone to think about, of why things are the way they are. And I know one time I heard that a person's disability is only meaningful because society is structured in a particular way to render them incapable of being able to participate fully. That if society were structured differently, you can make a disability disappear, because now the person can participate more fully, and knowing full well that churches have been very culpable in that.
Yeah, I would add to that. So my disability is an acquired disability, and it actually happened while I was in my doctoral program studying theology. And in many ways, the disability allowed me to see things that I hadn't been able to see before. So it's something of a superpower. And I noticed very quickly that having a disability is at least for me, being in that particular context, really helped me to look at my environment in a way that I hadn't before. So also talking in terms of the intersectionality, I was always uncomfortable walking into a room and being the only person of color, and never experienced before what it's like to be the only person in a room with a disability. And so that gave me a new understanding that I had not had previously, about what it means to be a person with a disability in an able-bodied society. And the realization that, yes, if society were structured differently to be more inclusive, then we wouldn't have the kinds of issues that we have around disability, that I'm not even sure if disability would be a term that exists. I think that we would probably use the term differently abled more so than disabled. So I think if somebody asked me if I would go back to the person who I was prior to my injury, I'm not sure that I would, because I think that in the world beforehand, there was a kind of delusion, a lack of awareness, that I'm ashamed to think that I was a part of. And the fact that it took me personally becoming disabled to understand what that is, what it means, and what it does to people in the world who are subsequently cut off from participating in our society. So yeah, I don't know if I would go back to quote unquote being normal if given the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah. More and more there's disability pride and crip pride, so that even in if the environment changes, there's still something unique disability has to offer to the world. And we'll look more at how that might happen in terms of worship. And thank you for sharing. Are there any other questions? I'm throwing a lot of heavy material at you.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I think part of the thing about the disabilities is that it's been even things in the Bible, like the blind man on
Yes.
the side of the road, and he gets healed, and I'm blind, and but I appreciate that back then things were a lot worse for blind people. They didn't have the opportunities that we do today, but I think it sort of promulgates people think, well, anybody who is blind or any other disability would want to be healed if they could, and which is not necessarily the case.
Of course. Thank you for sharing. So yeah, we're gonna look a bit about worship, because Nancy is known for her work on the crucified risen Jesus as the disabled God. She also emphasizes the need for and the theology of disabled leadership in churches. Can you read that quote? Right.
The church is impoverished without our presence. We reveal the physical truth of embodiment as a painstaking process of claiming and inhabiting our actually existing bodies.
So I use the work of liturgical scholar John Elders, another Canadian, and the lens of disability can help the liturgy embody how humanity at full touch before God and neighbor. Something I know you as Peter boldly proclaiming to. Disabled people are beginning to touch leadership practices. But overall, clergy with disabilities remain the unimagined and essentially excluded in pastoral energy. The weekly liturgy is the primary public expression of the church. Jacob notes training is deemed necessary to lead. Corporate worship always seems to morph from a time of responding to God to being in awe of the talent of others. Liturgy should liberate people from a culture that denies limits and glorifies the perfect body of mind. It can be a place of transforming our expectations of perfection to a focus on giving God glory through different bodies. On this side, there's a picture of a worship space in the accessible basement of a church containing a font, a cross, a Christ candle, from symbols, which is our LGBTQ2S community, and chairs. A United Church congregation in Hamilton has the practice of handing out scripture readings on Sunday mornings. More often than not, a man in a power chair pick up a reading. As he comes to the center to read, another member reaches for the microphone and holds it in front of him. Parked in his wheelchair, the paper crinkles as he unfolds it. Returning to the circle, he isn't congratulated, he isn't used as the sermon metaphor, and he isn't told that he shouldn't read every week. Rather, his leadership is expected imagined, and supported. Disability was honor to Koski says. It is a very strange disruption indeed to regard disability as key to the plan, as not only a possible participant, but a desirable one. By disrupting cultural norm of perfection, the congregation not only makes space for this man, but desires his leadership among them. The bodies of disabled liturgical leaders expose the masquerade perfection, revealing that all bodies are needed and affirmed. That we'll look at time. Disability is disruptive to the world, to people's experiences, and even to churches, including no understanding of time. Time has become managed in our capitalist society. The gift of liturgical time is countercultural. Sailors reminds us that liturgy is not something to be checked off a list, but rather a transformation that takes time. Imagining me as a presider requires communities to imagine time differently. For some, my speech begins as unintelligible, but over time become easier to understand. While I strive to keep my liturgies and lectures shorter, I challenge the community not to be bound by the chronos clock, but to live in Kairos time. Time in becoming accustomed to how one speaks is not only an issue of disability, but includes others within the full touch of humanity. Ministers from Westernized backgrounds, immigrant and Canadian born, experience congregations complaining of not understanding their speech or citing it as a reason not to call them. Working in liturgical time, we are called to settle into a different rhythm of activity and Sabbath, celebration and mourning, where one is not judged by productivity, but rather is invited into deeper relationship with God, creation, and one another. Disability activists have claimed crip time, which, as Alison Kafer explains, is a fresh time, not just expanded, but exploded. It requires reimagining our notion of what can and should happen in time, or recognizing how expectations of how long things take are based on particular minds and bodies, rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock. Crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. So as it bends the clock, the liturgical time creates imagination for valuing different approaches to participation in the leadership. A liturgy that counters society devaluing of time would imagine leadership in a liturgical crip time, where leadership is not based on worshiping in under an hour, and where we can encounter Jesus Christ, who has died, is risen, and will come again. Before I move on, are there any questions?
Yeah, this is Steve. I have a comment, and it was based on your comment about people not understanding you and using that as an excuse. And I know that that was also the case in a previous church that I went to, when an African priest from Kenya, I believe, came in, and
Yes.
people use that as an excuse. They couldn't understand him, so they left, and he didn't, if you listen to him, you gradually picked up his accent, and it became, nothing, but it was used as an excuse.
Yes, I have heard that.
Yeah, and it's, I would say even African American. I had a professor, a theological professor, tell me that he couldn't understand Black people from New York.
Yeah.
And I remember turning to my classmates on either side and asking them if they had any difficulty understanding what I was saying. So, yeah, that was eye-opening. But I want to go back, as I was sitting here, Miriam, reflecting on your previous slide about making the liturgical time, active participation, a time where people could actively participate in the liturgy. And I guess it's more of an observation. When I attended the Ash Wednesday service, well, first of all, I wasn't expecting to attend the Ash Wednesday service because of my vision. I don't drive after dark, so it was a real kind of chance for me to show up for the evening Ash Wednesday service. And then surprisingly, I was also asked to do one of the readings. And I haven't been a lector. I haven't read in church in 11 years because of my disability. But I had read the text prior to coming to church. So I felt, okay, well, I'm called to do this on this particular occasion. It wasn't a question, this is a calling, and you haven't read in 11 years, so you're gonna start again tonight. And one of the things that had kept me from reading previously is not wanting to bring my assisted reading device into church, feeling that that would be in some way disruptive, that it would take away from the reading. And B, the other part is, if I don't bring my assistive reading device, is the text, is the print going to be large enough for me to read? Thankfully, on Ash Wednesday, it was large enough for me to read. And so I was looking forward to getting off of the altar and going down the stairs where there's a handrail. Since I also have balance issues, and I can go up the stairs pretty well, but I can't go down the stairs really well. But I was asked to stay at the altar and to help with the imposition of ashes. And so as I was ready to walk down the stairs to help do that, I remember being called to walk down a different set of steps without a handrail. And I remember thinking, oh Lord, please don't let me fall down these steps. And so at that moment, it made me think about how would the church be more inclusive and inviting to persons with disability to participate in the liturgy. And my first thought was, we'll bring the lectern down in front of the altar so that people like me don't have to go up and down the stairs, and to make sure that the readings are large enough so that if I haven't read the readings, the text beforehand, and if I don't have my assistive reading device, I can still read. And also just to make sure that there are handrails accessible. But again, it wasn't until it became a real situation that I had experienced for myself, I didn't realize that liturgy is not as inclusive. The surrounding, the environment is not as inclusive as it could be for everyone to navigate and to fully participate. Sorry for the long ramble, but I wanted to share that.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm reminded, I like to remind people that the liturgy is the work of the people. So if people aren't represented in the liturgy, and then I think there's an issue. Jim.
Yeah.
You're on mute, sorry.
Miriam, today happens to be the anniversary of the death of a very wonderful young lady who was a member of our worship community more than 2 decades ago. And she was the first, I believe, person to introduce individuals with disabilities into our church in the 1990s. And her name is Maureen Nielsen. Unfortunately, she was killed almost more than 20 years ago when she was serving in Haiti. But I'm sure that she would have wished to be here tonight, listening to you, sharing with you, because she was extraordinary. And over the years, we've welcomed people with physical disabilities, mental disabilities into our worship. And I think we've made efforts to give them the time to be recognized and also to share with them our love for the people with disabilities. So, Maureen, we remember you today on your anniversary of your death. Thank you.
Wonderful, Jim.
You know, Miriam, something I was thinking about is particularly what I've heard from a lot of people in the disability community is that during COVID, like so much of the world began to catch up with the disability community. And suddenly all these permissions were granted, like working from home, working remotely, working on more Kairos time instead of Chronos time. But suddenly when it benefited the majority to do this, things moved with incredible speed. But I'm even thinking of online services, like for many people who might have mobility issues, getting to a service was the only way people could participate, a few years ago. And now the idea of inclusion is just, it's so different of who is the community, who is the technology made for, who is accommodated and who is not. Anyway, I see some of what you're talking about, both in liturgy, but also reflected in wider society, but particularly during COVID, because so much changed so rapidly to accommodate a certain group of people, when for decades, other groups of people had been asking for very similar accommodations, and nothing was granted. Yeah, Meredith?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that now actually things are closing down again. And I'm very grateful for Spiritus for continuing to be available online, because now when it suits the majority, workplaces are saying everyone needs to return. And this is excluding large numbers of us who have problems with our immune systems, for instance. And there are ways in which that this return to normal, we're returning to something that was never normal for many people with disabilities.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you, Meredith, and thank you, Mike. When the majority needs something to happen fast, it happens right away.
Rosemary, did you unmute? Did you want to say something?
Yes, I like the inclusiveness of Spiritus. I live in Olympia, Washington, and I'm at Mass every day now for the last 2 years. And I also have vision issues. I'm legally blind, and I went to my parish. I've been a reader for years, and this was before the pandemic. And I hope to go back. And I went to the person in charge of liturgy and told her about it and asked her to please print the readings or the prayers that I was going to do that day in bold and in large print. And it made it possible for me to read longer, and I hope I can still do it when I go back. And I think it's just, I have learned to be proactive and to ask for what I needed. I know that's a lot of people don't, but that's something that we all need to learn, is to ask for what we need to be able to be full participants.
Yeah, self-advocacy is important.
Yeah, it's so incredibly important to be able to advocate for oneself. On the flip side of that coin is the ability to have that advocacy received in the spirit of inclusion. I have advocated for myself, and in a number of instances, that self-advocacy has been met with a wall. As we've just said, if not for the pandemic, many people would still be fighting to work from home. or to do the things that magically happened overnight because of the pandemic, things that happened overnight that persons with disabilities have been advocating and asking and fighting for years and years and years. So when it's beneficial to a majority, it happens quickly. Sometimes, you know, when I have asked somebody for something, they've been very, very receptive and very, very understanding. But again, there have been times when I have been met with absolute hostility. And again, I'm talking about in Catholic institutions and in churches, various parishes, which again, it was part of why I stepped away from church for a very long time and why until this past Ash Wednesday, I hadn't read in church in over 11 years.
Right.
So most definitely, it's helpful to learn to advocate for oneself, but being mindful that part of why we're having this conversation tonight is because those requests aren't always met with graciousness and understanding and action, unfortunately.
Thank you. And I see my boy has posted a question. If you don't mind, I'm going to finish this presentation because I'm mindful that we don't have all night tonight, and then we'll have some time for some more conversation. So I want to talk a little about communion. The whole of worship is experienced through all bodies, including the movement of communion. Take, bless, break, and pour. Do this in remembrance of me. The intentionality of these actions slows us down to be present to our relationship with Christ. A couple of weeks after my ordination, I presided at communion in my home congregation. I have a picture of that on the PowerPoint now. Sitting in one of the pews was Reverend Seiji Awiga, a United Church minister. Following the service, with tears in his eyes, he said to me, "You were Jesus for me." Initially, I felt discomfort, as many in the church have spiritualized disabled people with damaging effects. However, upon reflection, I think he spoke to me as a minister who faced barriers in the church and in society because of his Japanese heritage. Both of us were welcome at the table, and in the midst of joy, struggle, and yearning, we continue to be shaped as Christians, imagining God's kingdom as a place where both of our leadership give are not only welcome or tolerated with desires. Nancy spoke about how communion became a ritual of segregation and degradation because of her inability to kneel under will. Sharing the story of a theologian who was denied entrance to seminary because of his until he could perform the sacrament appropriately. She notes, in making a Eucharist a physical practice of exclusion, the Church demonstrates a tangible bias against our non-conventional bodies and dishonors the disabled God. Participating in the prayer of great thanksgiving led by a disabled minister, receiving the elements from someone with a disability and accompanying disabled people as we receive the elements can be an act of resistance. Post-colonial scholars note how the Eucharist has the potential to be liberating or oppressive for groups who have been denied access and authority to appreciate it. I have a quote in my text. I'm gonna skip it for tonight, but you can read it later. And so when disabled people preside at the Eucharist, there is also a subversive performance happening. With the limitations of my movements, I require assistance in breaking and importing. When the limits of us, when our limits are imagined or expected, space opens up for creativity and interdependence in the liturgy. A ministry of interdependence may sound beautiful. It is also messy and disruptive. It requires communication and trust, honesty in working together. Presiding at table with another person as I speak the words bears witness to our common humanity, vulnerability, and thus our need for God and each other in our discipleship. With humility, I hope my leadership is an altered body practice of the Eucharist that is the evidence that the grace of God comes through grace. Hence it is one should call for justice and the recognition of the value of conventional bodies. The table bends to fit my body, to fit the bodies of others who are enacting the words of institution, and to fit the real bodies of those who receive the gift of bread for the journey and the cup of blessing. Imagining disabled people as presiders at the table, liturgy can act as a commitment to justice, sending us forth to transform the society to be one based on love and compassion and solidarity. And so I think I will stop sharing now and leave just a few minutes for conversation. I'm sorry about that. Questions?
Yeah, Meredith.
Meredith.
I really appreciated the connections there that can be made to feminist theology, the focus on vulnerability, the idea of disabled people accepting assistance and recognizing limitations, being upfront about limitations and being embodied. This is the concept of vulnerability is something that is so important to me as a contrast to the patriarchal ideals of the self-sufficient person who is completely invulnerable and impermeable. And I wanted to link it also to ageism, because I'm both disabled and a geriatrician, or used to be able to be a geriatrician. And my patients, people would sometimes see what my patients were going through and would think that this was just a horrible option to have to end up disabled or somehow in a lesser state of health as they experienced it. And I would just point out that the only option besides eventually becoming disabled is to die relatively suddenly at a young age. So probably it's better that we all end up experiencing disability. And indeed, we mostly will. And if we could think of disability and vulnerability as something we will all experience, I think it would lead to a better model.
Thank you.
Amanda.
I know I've spoken multiple times tonight, and I'll make this quick. You know, my mom, who's on the call, and my dad, who passed in November, have needed, for the first time in our lives, we've needed aides and care people. And, again, this brings up a lot of emotion for me tonight, in part because of how ignorant I've been of the realities of so many people. And so, like, I didn't pay much attention to how much care workers made, how they were treated, and others in the world absolutely rely on people, for kind of the day-to-day life. And my life had lived pretty separate from that for so much of it. Anyway, I just really appreciate some of the connections you're making for me tonight. It's very humbling to and for me also maybe shows me yet again that I can have consciousness in one arena and unconsciousness in many others. That just because I might know something about something, it doesn't translate to other pieces. So it really it gives me, I don't know, just really appreciating your leadership tonight, really appreciating you as a minister to me and to our community.
And thank you, Mama, for your comments. I'm sorry about your stepdaughter. I pray that she may be well. You manage okay too.
So for others who've been taking in a lot, does this connect with something in your life? Does it get you thinking about something? Is there a takeaway that you have? Is there a connection with faith or something you might want to explore further? Or would you want to do more of this sometime in the future?
Well, I asked to start a small Christian community for persons with disabilities and chronic illnesses. And after tonight, I feel more strongly about wanting to be able to do that at Spiritus. I think it's really important. I also want to say that it reminded me of the presentation that I did for Black Catholics and thinking of To the Ends of the Earth and having persons with disability celebrate the Eucharist and standing on the altar, wherever the altar may be, is really a vision of To the Ends of the Earth and centering the marginalized.
Yeah, presiding at communion is such a gift. And I'm glad you're making Courtney's dream a reality.
Yeah, there was a proposal that came to some of the folks on the pastoral team, and it's a slightly slow process, but we're working to kind of make sure it becomes something that is going to happen. I also just want to thank everyone who's on the call tonight, especially those who identified a disability, identified themselves. There's a risk anytime someone does that. And so just grateful for all those who've named something, because there are things we can witness and there are things we can't witness. And so appreciating all those who are speaking from lived experience. So I know some of you at 8:40 are going to wish you had said something. You're going to be thinking and saying, oh, God, I should have, my heart was burning. I don't know why I didn't say that. I don't know why I didn't ask Miriam, this internationally known crip theologian that I had access to. I failed to put out that question that was burning. And so we have just a few minutes left. This is kind of like a telethon. Now's the most important time to call. But if there's something burning in your heart, if there's something you want to say, if there's something you want to appreciate, now's a great time to do that.
Have people heard about the disabled God before? Was that new?
That was new to me, and it looks like a very interesting book for sure that I'll pick up. And I do want to thank you for being here and presenting. It was great.
It was new for me. So I'm really, Miriam, I really appreciate what you had to say. And I thank you very
much. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great to have a glimpse into your community.
And, Miriam, we would love to continue to connect with you in a variety of ways, however that takes shape, including some maybe future diving deeper into scriptural passages. Those they're really doing some more in-depth theological work. And so grateful for what you've started us on tonight. And each week, some of the presenters have offered a short bibliography, and that may be in the Google Doc that there may be some books. But if there are podcasts, if there are documentaries, if there are, a few are in the chat already. But if there are just a few resources where you would say, including the journal that you helped to edit, right? There's a, please make sure we hear what you have to offer. But everyone who's on tonight, I think I have their email, and so we can send out a group email to everyone with a few of those resources, including the Google Doc again. So thanks. Anyone else, last words before we maybe just take a moment of quiet and centering? All right, then maybe just again, we all share breath. And so just breathe in the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the disabled God, the Spirit of the differently abled God, the one who bends the table to fit us, the one who asks us not just to tolerate, but desire, the one who invites us to recognize each other as the divine image, as we are. And so maybe in the stillness of our breath and prayer tonight, there's a commitment we wish to make. There's an affirmation. There's something that stirs in us that we just give it a little more space. And that may be something we need to say in the world. It may be something we need to pursue. It may be someone who comes to mind. It may be a risk we wish to take. But to just be open to where God is leading you after tonight. And to give thanks for all those who are here, all those who are with us in spirit, all those who brought us to the understandings that we have right now. And really, as Meredith reminded us, that we remind ourselves that we are all moving towards a disability, towards different functioning. And so really asking for our own openness to whatever comes to us, to receive its gifts, and to be with others and receive theirs. Amen. If you wish to stick around for a minute, we'll keep the room open. I know we said we'd go till 8:30 and we're 7 minutes beyond, so sorry about that. We have one more scheduled session next week. We're going to be looking at decolonizing and faith. The speaker was Lily Mendoza, and Lily and her partner Jim Perkinson, coming out of Detroit. Lily has a slight conflict, and so Jim is going to be doing the first part, and Lily is going to be joining us for the second. They're really quite amazing folks, and so if you're able to join us again next Wednesday, we'd love to have you. Same time, same channel. But I'll be in touch during the week just to send out another email with some resources or anything else left over from this week. And we are recording all of these. So let me stop.